The moment the clock struck 10:00 this morning, something snapped. And no, not quietly, not behind palace curtains, but in a way that sent a shockwave straight through the illusion people have been clinging to for years. Because when Tom Bower walked out of the High Court holding that navy blue folder labeled strictly confidential, it wasn't just a document, it was a warning shot. So a signal that the carefully curated fairy tale around Meghan Markle and Prince Harry was no longer protected by silence. It was being peeled open layer by layer in broad daylight. And here's the part that should make you uneasy. Because while the world watched London, something far more surgical was already unfolding thousands of miles away. At exactly 8:15 a.m. California time, while Montecito was still wrapped in that soft, deceptive morning calm, a black SUV rolled up to those gates. No flashing lights, no chaos, just precision. A courier stepped out, carrying a document that insiders are already calling the point of no return. Summons number 2026-4. Not a warning, not a negotiation, a move. And the response? Cold. Clinical. This isn't an invitation for a meeting, this is a notification of a forensic seizure. That sentence didn't just land, it echoed. Because in that moment, the story shifted. This wasn't royal drama anymore. This was federal machinery locking into place. Now pause and think about this. Why now? Why this coordinated timing between London and California? Because when you start connecting these moments, it stops looking random. It starts looking orchestrated. Because inside that navy blue folder, according to Bauer, there's a financial crater, a $3.4 million discrepancy tied to the Arkewell Foundation. Not pocket change, not a rounding error. A gap so large it forces one uncomfortable question. Where did the money actually go? And this is where things get disturbingly methodical. The IRS doesn't guess, it calculates. Step 1, they map your lifestyle. Every jet, every security detail, every polished appearance of wealth. Step 2, they compare it against what you officially reported. And step 3, that's the trigger. When the numbers don't align for years, the system doesn't blink, it moves. And when it moves, it doesn't ask politely. It freezes, it strips, it exposes. Tom Bower didn't hold back outside that court. He said the mask of charity has cracked. Think about that. Not slipped, not questioned, cracked. And if that's true, then everything built on top of it, every speech, every brand deal, every carefully staged narrative starts to look less like success and more like performance. A performance funded by what exactly? Because here's where it gets uncomfortable again. The money from Princess Diana's inheritance? Reportedly gone. The big corporate backing? Fading. The Netflix lifeline? Quietly stepping back. So what's left holding up that lifestyle? That mansion, those appearances, that image of effortless wealth. Because if the foundation is unstable, then everything above it isn't just at risk, it's already falling. And maybe, just maybe, that's why this feels less like a sudden collapse and more like a delayed reaction. Because if you rewind this story, the clues were always there, hidden in plain sight. The meeting back in 2016 at Soho House wasn't just a romantic coincidence, it was, as investigators suggest, a carefully engineered environment, the kind that shapes perception before reality has a chance to catch up. And for a while, it worked. It worked so well that no one questioned the speed, the shifts, the detachment from the royal institution, until the silence broke. Because when Spare dropped in January 2023, it wasn't just a memoir, it was a confession. And confessions don't just disappear. They sit, they wait, and sometimes they come back with consequences. Legal ones, immigration ones, the kind that don't care about titles or sympathy, because systems like that don't respond to narratives. They respond to facts, documented, recorded, admitted. By the time we hit early 2025, the cracks weren't just visible, they were widening. Deals fading, public perception shifting. That carefully managed image losing traction. And when the financial support started drying up, something else became exposed, the dependency. Because without the constant inflow, the entire structure suddenly had to stand on its own weight. And it didn't. Which brings us right back to now, back to today, back to that synchronized moment. 10:00 we're in London, 8:15 in California. Two events that feel less like coincidence and more like alignment. Because when systems on both sides of the Atlantic start moving at the same time, it's not random, it's deliberate, it's calculated, and it's final. So the question isn't what is happening. That part is already unfolding. The real question is, how long has this been building behind the scenes? How many warnings were ignored? And more importantly, what's still hidden inside that navy blue folder that hasn't been revealed yet? Because if this is just the opening move, then what comes next isn't going to be quiet. It's going to be loud, unavoidable, and impossible to spin. And just when it felt like the pressure couldn't climb any higher, something even colder began unfolding, not in public, not in front of cameras, but deep inside the kind of systems that don't react, they execute. Because while everyone was still obsessing over that navy blue folder and the shockwaves from London, a second layer of this story was quietly activating in the background. A layer that doesn't deal in headlines, but in consequences. And the center of that storm, it leads straight back to Prince Harry and a ticking clock most people didn't even realize had started. Because here's the detail that changes everything. For years, Harry's presence in the United States wasn't just casual residency, it was protected, shielded under a visa category that implied status, purpose, and official standing. But now, that shield is being questioned, line by line, and not by tabloids, not by commentators, but by legal mechanisms that don't speculate, they verify. Because once admissions from his own words, from his own recorded voice, begin to intersect with immigration law, the narrative stops being personal and starts becoming procedural. And procedure? That's where things get brutal. There's a clause buried deep in the system that doesn't care who you are or what your last name represents. It only cares about what you admitted. And when those admissions involve substances documented and distributed globally, they don't just disappear into storytelling. They sit there waiting to be matched. And now, according to sources circling this case, that match has happened. A cross-agency alignment of data from financial investigations intersecting with immigration records. Quietly, precisely. And once that connection is made, the system doesn't hesitate, it reclassifies. And this is where the tension spikes. Because the downgrade being discussed isn't symbolic, it's operational. A shift from protected status to something far more fragile. A category that comes with limits, restrictions, and one terrifying addition, a countdown. 30 days. That's the number being whispered behind closed doors. 30 days to resolve, to exit, or to face something far more public and irreversible. And suddenly, the idea that this could escalate beyond legal paperwork into something visible becomes very real. But while that clock begins ticking, something equally unsettling is happening on the other side of the equation. Because Meghan Markle isn't standing still in this storm. No, she's moving fast. And not in front of cameras, but in offices, in filings, in attempts to stabilize something that might already be slipping. Because witnesses reportedly saw a moment that didn't make headlines, but maybe should have. An urgent appearance, a high security presence, and a request that raised more questions than it answered. A passport issue, a verification, a detail as small as a birth date suddenly becoming critical. Now think about that for a second. Why would something so basic suddenly matter so much? Because when documents begin to collide, when past records, travel logs, and institutional data start to tell slightly different versions of the same story, that's when systems flag inconsistencies. And inconsistencies, in the eyes of federal processes, aren't just mistakes, they're triggers. And if even one of those triggers is validated, the ripple effect doesn't stop at paperwork. It spreads. Contracts, agreements, identities, everything tied to that foundation begins to shake. And this is where things take a darker turn. Because the Mediterranean files, those same files hinted at in that Navy folder, aren't just whispers anymore. They're being treated as data points, logs, timestamps, movements that don't align with the public narrative that's been sold for years. And at the center of it all is a name that keeps resurfacing in quiet conversations. Arawak, a yacht, a location. But more importantly, a network. Because what's raising alarms isn't just where she was, it's who else was there. Names that, according to insiders, already existed on watch lists long before this story exploded into the mainstream. And suddenly, what used to sound like distant rumors begins to feel like something else entirely. Something structured, something documented. And when those past associations begin to intersect with present investigations, the question stops being, is this relevant? And becomes, how far does this go? But here's where it gets even more unsettling. Because buried inside those files is a detail so small most people would overlook it, but so critical it could unravel everything. A date. A year. A 6-year gap that doesn't just challenge perception, it challenges legitimacy. Because if the timeline that's been publicly accepted doesn't align with institutional records, then every document built on that timeline becomes vulnerable. And vulnerability, in legal terms, is dangerous. Now imagine the scale of that. Marriage records, contracts, identity verifications. If one foundational detail is proven inconsistent, the legal term for what happens next isn't mild, it's absolute. Void from the beginning, meaning not altered, not corrected, erased, as if it never held weight to begin with. And that's not just a personal crisis, that's a structural collapse. And while all of this is tightening in the background, something symbolic but deeply intentional is happening back in London. Because when Prince William stepped forward alongside Catherine, Princess of Wales, flanked by steady, uncontroversial figures, it wasn't just optics, it was messaging. Silent, controlled, but unmistakable. A reshaping of the narrative. A signal that the institution isn't waiting for resolution, it's already moving on. And maybe that's the most chilling part of all. Not the investigations, not the documents, but the silence, the unanswered calls, the closed doors. Because when connections that once seemed unbreakable suddenly go quiet, it doesn't feel temporary. It feels final. So now we're left standing at a point where every path forward looks complicated. One direction leads to separation, another to retreat, but the one that keeps surfacing, the one supported by the weight of everything unfolding, is something far more absolute. A collapse that isn't explosive but gradual, systematic, piece by piece, until there's nothing left to hold the story together. And just when you think you've reached the edge of what can be revealed, one final detail surfaces. A name, quietly embedded in those Mediterranean logs. A name that doesn't just raise eyebrows, it raises alarms. Because if that connection is confirmed, if those timelines overlap the way insiders suggest they do, then this story doesn't just stay within royal boundaries, it expands into something global. Something far more complicated than anyone expected. And that's where this leaves us. Not at an ending, but at a threshold. Because the truth isn't fully out yet, not completely, but it's getting closer. And when it finally surfaces in full, it won't just change the narrative, it will rewrite it entirely.